top security officials are trying to warn Americans about what the Kremlin is doing to disrupt the upcoming midterm elections.
Our democracy itself is in the crosshairs.
We acknowledge the threat. It is real.
But for whatever reason, President Trump does not believe that. Here's what he said just hours after they spoke.
Now we're being hindered by the Russian hoax. It's a hoax, okay?
We don't know why the president is ignoring the warnings of his intel and national security chiefs or why he sent them to the podium to say all of that. But it highlights one of the most puzzling contradictions of this presidency. Why does President Trump believe Vladimir Putin over the top U.S. officials who say that the threat is real and that democracy is in the crosshairs?
That is his Homeland Security chief who made that point. It's been nearly 3 weeks since the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki. We still don't know what the two leaders discussed in private. The director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, said he still does not fully understand what happened between the 2-hour meeting between the two of them. But we have one clue. President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, sought to reassure the country, insisting that Vladimir Putin says, yes, Putin, that election interference was the very first issue that President Trump brought up. Joining us now, CNN national security commentator Mike Rogers and CNN senior national security analyst Lisa Monaco. Welcome to you both. Mike Rogers, I've been thinking this morning going through this, trying to understand how you have administration officials, members of the national security team, who say one thing and a president who says the other. It is as if President Bush, after 9/11, would have said, well, this al-Qaeda threat and them attacking us again, I think that's overblown. We're not really sure it was al-Qaeda. I don't think it's a big deal. In fact, it's a hoax, while the entire government put the country on a war footing. Is that not the analogy that applies here?
Well, I just don't think it's helpful when the president gets off the reservation or maybe never comes onto the reservation on a particular issue, especially this one. The Russians are doing more than just targeting our elections. There was a public report not that long ago. They were trying to get into our electric grid. They've been much more aggressive in cyberspace in a very bad way in the last probably year. And all of that's a problem. That's why you saw all of those folks on the podium saying, hey, we have a problem and we are at least telling our workforces and America, we are going to do something about it. That part I thought was good. I wish the president, I think the president can't, he cannot make the difference between the Russians swinging an election and what the Russians are trying to do by just interfering in American politics. He just can't separate the two, and I think that's why he says things like he did last night after these folks.
Can I just follow on one point on that and point to Lisa, because I'm not even equating 9/11 with what the interference was in 2016. It's the comparison to the response. Do you think the president distancing himself from what the government is doing undercuts the effectiveness of what the government is doing to detect further interference and to protect the country's infrastructure against that interference?
So, David, I think your analogy works in the following way. You have the intelligence chiefs, that national security officials, saying our country is under attack, our democracy is in the crosshairs, the system is blinking red. That's what the director of national intelligence said a few weeks ago. All of the same kind of verbiage we had around 9/11. And then you have the commander-in-chief, the president, not echoing those same statements. And in fact, in many places, including standing next to our main adversary, not taking the opportunity to echo those statements and indeed to undercut the intelligence community and his law enforcement community, which is trying to seek justice, to hold people accountable for the attack on our democracy that happened in 2016, and that President Trump's own national security officials say is ongoing and pervasive.
It gets even more confusing, guys, because our reporting is that President Trump agreed to have those national security officials go out to the podium or even sent them out to the podium. And so Phil Mudd, who you all know, I believe, he's one of our CNN analysts. He's a former CIA and FBI counterterrorism official. He said that he believes that the only reason that the president would send them out when the president doesn't believe what they were saying was a PR stunt. So listen to him.
That was not a security meeting yesterday. Let me throw a penalty flag here. And that was not a red light. That was the White House using a bunch of people so for the next 2 months they can use a talking point that said, hey, every time somebody raises Russia to Sarah Sanders, she's going to say, look, the president directed those guys you saw and also those women you saw on the podium to go do something about Russia. That was a PR stunt. Give me a break. Yes, they got used.
So, Mike Rogers, he's not suggesting that they were disingenuous. That obviously they want to get their message out. They'll take any opportunity they can, our national security heads, but that this somehow gives the president cover when he then calls it a hoax.
I'm not sure. I think it was great that we had all of our intelligence officials up there saying this is a problem. And then they outlined a little bit what each department is going to do. The one thing that I didn't like about it is there's just not one person calling the shots from the White House on coordinating a really difficult effort, which is this cyber problem. But having them out there, Allison, I just think good on those folks for getting out there. For whatever the reason, the president said they ought to go out there. And some have even argued that maybe it's a legal strategy that he can go in and say, these are all the 10 things I did on Russia. How can I be colluding with Russia in some other way? Okay, got that too. The important thing is we are under siege, and cyber is getting worse, and it is the Russians plus other nation states now getting into this game. And without this very public push, I think the workforce was getting discouraged. I think maybe some of our efforts wouldn't have gotten done. Now these folks can come back to the White House and say, we want offensive operation status on these types of things. All of that to me is good.
Well, and without a cyber attack coordinator, a cyber weapons coordinator inside the White House, the coordination aspect of it gets hindered. Potential operations being coordinated gets hindered. But to both of you, and Lisa, I'll start with you. What is the most effective way for any administration under these circumstances to put pressure on Russia, to communicate with Russia about that we're not going to take it? Because I think there's a tendency in the press to think, oh, well, what we've got to do is see evidence that President Trump beat Putin over the head with a baseball bat in a meeting. That's not how it's going to go. Obama said, you got to cut it out. That didn't exactly do it. What would your recommendation be how to send that message?
Well, first, I think, David, it's got to be a unified message. So I disagree a little bit with Phil. I think it was very important. It was necessary. It was important. And frankly, it was overdue to have that grouping in the national security officials in the White House briefing room. And incredibly rare, I might add, especially to have the FBI director there, who usually doesn't speak in those types of announcements with anything but an FBI seal or a Department of Justice seal in front of him. So this was, I think, quite rare and very important, though, for him to be there, given the FBI role and mission in this space. But I think the important thing, particularly for President Putin, is to have a unified message, but critically to have that message come from the very top. I think if you talk to Russia experts, they will tell you that President Putin listens to one person, if he listens to anybody, and the only message he's probably looking for is one from Donald Trump. And we heard from John Bolton, if the reports are true, that President Putin says that Donald Trump raised this issue when they met in Helsinki, but it obviously wasn't very effective because President Trump's own national security chiefs say that the attack is ongoing.
Right, but Mike, he may just listen to President Trump, but when the FBI is leading the effort on counterintelligence, as a former intelligence officer, he understands that that's the tip of the spear for the American government, interdicting what the Russians may be trying to do.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you for one thing. As an old FBI guy, one thing that the FBI can do domestically is play mostly defense. So they can find it, they can disrupt it, they can notify parties, they can help try to defend against it. The most important guy in that room yesterday was the NSA and cyber commander. Because if you're going to impact the Russians' behavior, you're going to have to engage in operations that provide some disruptive end game, if you will.
Right.
And and all of that, by the way, needs the approval of the president. That's why we need to make sure that the president really is on board with this, because those would be offensive cyber operations that need, that would fall under some covert action plan, which would need the president's signature on to do that. That part, to me, is really important. If you're going to mess up the Russians, we're going to have to be more aggressive. and the FBI is going to have to help these states try to defend themselves. And so they can provide intelligence, they can provide after the fact, they can go in and try to do some things. But as I said,
how can you do that without the president authorizing it?
Right, we've heard many people
really important.
have made that point, that in fact this is not just rhetorical. It's important that the president engage and be involved. But to your point, Lisa, it was so interesting yesterday to hear the DNI have to admit that he still doesn't know what happened in that one-on-one meeting in Helsinki with President Putin and President Trump. Here's that moment.
I'm not in a position to either understand fully or talk about what happened at Helsinki. I'll turn it over to the National Security Director here to address that question.
He'll toss that hot potato right into John Bolton's lap. And what John Bolton then said, Lisa, was, well, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but according to President Putin, President Trump did bring up election interference. President Putin is our source for what happened in that meeting?
Right. Allison, it's mind-boggling that we're getting a readout of a 2-hour meeting between President Trump and one of our main adversaries, who his own intelligence community has said directed an attack on our election and on our democracy. We're getting that readout from President Putin. Look, it's mind-boggling that the Director of National Intelligence, weeks after this meeting, does not have a readout. In my experience, when I was the Homeland Security Advisor and these types of meetings would take place, well, first of all, they didn't take place without having other staff in the room, or at least a note taker who could memorialize the conversation and, very importantly, give that to our intelligence analysts and experts who could then use it, take it in, understand it, and use it to inform our efforts in the future. So to not have that, I think, really deprives our experts and deprives us of having a better understanding. But in the past, I've seen presidents come out from meetings and debrief their staff right down to things like body language and talking about reactions. And that's what you would really want to see. But can I make one other point, which is to say that to not have somebody in the White House, the cybersecurity coordinator, to not have that position, which has been jettisoned by the White House, to not have somebody focusing 24/7 on this issue in the White House is malpractice, in my view, particularly when the intelligence community says we are continuing to be under attack.
Thank you for making that point. That is so, we need to underscore it all the time. There was that position, and that person was let go.
That's right.
So, Lisa, Monica, Mike Rogers, thank you both very much for all of your expertise on this.